The sexual revolution and identity politics. I would like to start with what happened in the United States last summer, because the book came out a year before the riots and protests in the US, and I could not help but feel as if they vindicated the thesis of the book, because the book argues that in the absence of religion, in the absence of family, in the absence of what throughout human history have been very primal attachments for all human beings, in the absence of those things, as those things weaken across the Western world, we see an increasingly impassioned flight to identity politics, to collective identities. And the reason for that flight is that, fundamental to all of us is the question, who am I? And if you were to ask me, who am I would probably say something like, I'm a mother, I'm a Catholic, I'm an aunt, I'm a wife, etc. In other words, my intuitive response would be to define myself by my primal attachments. What we have to understand is that in this day and age, a lot of people do not have strong attachments of that nature. We live in societies that are secularizing rapidly. So that takes one answer off the table. Who am I? I'm a child of God. A lot of people wouldn't say that, wouldn't think to say that, don't believe that. But then we get into the more complicated tangle of defining oneself by relations to one's family. And let me say at the outset, there's not a family in the world that is not affected by the trends that we are describing. We're all in this together. So when I talk about something like, say, divorce and remarriage, and what that does to the sibling relationships of people with half-brothers, step-brothers, etc. I'm coming from a place where I know as much about this as you do, which is that it's ubiquitous. But what these more attenuated relationships have done over time is weaken the emotional attachments of people. They've weakened the gravitational pull that people feel toward their families. And we're not talking about Ozzie and Harriet, perfect nuclear family. We're talking about the extended family, which for most of us has shrunk by quite a lot. So I get into this in Primal Screams for a couple of reasons. One is that I really do believe that in the rise in mental health problems, in the increasing acting out that we see on campuses, people duct taping their mouths shut, people having nervous breakdowns about pronouns, I think what we're seeing is a deep unraveling that's coming about because so many people, especially young people, can't answer that question, who am I, by resort to their native families, if you will. And this leaves a big lacuna that has to be filled by something. And I think increasingly it's being filled by identity politics. Getting back to what happened in the streets of the United States, there were in 2020 over 10,000 incidents of what's politely called unrest in city after city. And over 500 of these devolved into what is impolitely called riots. This is unprecedented in American history. Nothing like this has happened. So where is this coming from? Well, of course, the conventional answer is police brutality and racism. And it's true that police brutality energized a lot of people, especially young people, who were already living under the restrictions of the pandemic, etc. This is what started it, but this is not what kept the momentum going night after night in cities like Portland, where you would see the same young people out there throwing things, attacking the police. This does not explain the level of sheer emotiveness that we saw in these riots. These did not look like civil rights protests. They didn't even look like anti-Vietnam protests from what I've seen of that footage. This was very raw, primordial stuff that was in the streets of America. And we can see that very clearly in the sort of street theater that this devolved into, where people, protesters and rioters, were going around into residential neighborhoods, shining lights into people's homes as they were sleeping, or disrupting people who were out trying to dine outdoors. In the rage that we see in those acts, I believe we can see through it to a place where people are so unhinged and so devoid of attachment, of primal attachments of their own, that they're now taking it out on people who they perceive to have those things. That is the deeper meaning of all that anger spilling into residential neighborhoods and attacking innocent bystanders who had nothing to do with police brutality or racism, but were representative of a kind of world, a kind of order that many young people are now having serious trouble finding. And that, to me, is the deeper meaning of what we saw in the streets. We saw identity politics as an unstable substitute for more stable connections to family and community.
Mm. And Mary, what I like about your analysis as well, I heard your brilliant conversation with Christina Hoff Sommers, who I have a lot of respect for as well. And in that you talk about how identity politics, it's very fashionable for people on the right to attack people on the left with it. But actually, you talk also about the rise of the incel community. You talk about the rise of white nationalism, such as it is. I'm not saying it's widespread, but it certainly exists, right? So the idea of identifying with a group seems to appeal across the political spectrum to people. And it certainly makes sense that, I can feel it. You talk about being religious. Francis and I are both non-believers, but the awareness of the fact that people crave community, and also the emergence of the sort of woke thing that feels very religious in nature. It's got its inquisitions, it's got its cancel culture, it's got all of that. It does seem like what you're saying is true. So I guess the question is, all that being accepted, it's not like, I don't imagine you're suggesting reversing the sexual revolution and disappearing the pill and contraceptives, are you?
No, I'm talking about renorming society in a more reasonable direction, which we do all the time. Human beings do learn from mistakes. And one of the prime examples of this is what's happened with tobacco smoking over the last 60 years. And I say this not to knock smokers, but everybody knows there's been a sea change. Everybody knows that decades of evidence about the negative effects of this substance made it easier for people to quit and made it more stigmatized than it had been. Tobacco use indoors is very stigmatized, at least in the United States. And all of this was the result of empirical evidence eventually filtering down to individual decisions. And that, I think, is what needs to happen with the sexual revolution, because the costs of it are not only, on the individual level of romance, and not only in our increasingly untethered woke politics, but also the shrinkage of the family and the fracturing of the family has raised the costs of the welfare state across the Western world. The state has had to come in and be that substitute daddy. The state simultaneously bankrolls the broken family and has to. So these are pretty major consequences that affect the most advanced economies of the world in every single country. So we're not talking about private consensual transactions here. And that's what's really ironic to me in the long run, is that everybody says this is only about private decisions, right? Sexual matters are completely off the table. We can't talk about this stuff. It's all private and it's all about consent. And yet nothing has done as much to transform our world as this revolution has, socially, politically, as I mentioned in Primal Screams, psychologically and otherwise. So it's something we probably ought to look at, it seems to me.